Okay, I think it's time for us to get started. My name is Bob Norman, and on behalf of the York County Historical Committee, I'd like to welcome you this afternoon to our presentation. Our speaker for today is Mr. Michael Moore. He is a well-known local historian, author, and a lecturer, and he will be discussing the Civil War's impact on Yorktown. Michael is historian and curator of Lee Hall Mansion and Inview Plantation. He received a Bachelor of Arts degree in history from Christopher Newport University and a Master of Arts in history from Old Dominion University. He has curated exhibits at several historic sites and led battlefield tours in 4 states. He was instrumental in placing 4 sites, local sites, including Inview Plantation, on the National Register of Historic Places. Michael has co-authored 2 books, The Peninsula Campaign of 1862, A Military Analysis, which was published in 2005, and Yorktown's Civil War Siege, Drums Along the Warwick, which was published in 2012. He has also served as the editor and photographic editor for 12 books and has written numerous articles for different publications. Copies of his books will be available for sale and signing by the author downstairs immediately following the lecture, and he will also be available to discuss further anything that concerning this topic that you'd like to talk about. So, without further introduction, I will turn it over to Mr. Michael Moore.
Good afternoon. Wow, I know a whole bunch of you. Thank you for taking your Sunday to come out and visit and talk a little bit about Yorktown. First, I want to thank Bob Norman and the other members of the York County Historical Committee for inviting me to speak this afternoon. It's very kind of you to have me out. I also want to recognize Bob Newman, Tim Smith, Colonel Eric Bush, Owen Lanier, and the late, great Dr. Adrian Wheat for expanding my knowledge of Civil War Yorktown. So even though people consider you an expert or someone who's fairly familiar with something, we all had people that helped give us some knowledge when we were younger, and even as we get older. You know, we have people we work with. Finally, I would be remiss in not thanking Maureen Weiss for assisting me in my research for today's lecture. We share a passion for Yorktown's many layers of history. And also my friend Bill Miller, who's known me 20-something years, Tom Cairo and his wife, George, my neighbor, and some other friends that I've met, volunteer from Lee Hall, so we thank you all for being here. All right, when we think about Yorktown, what do we usually think of when you came to visit Yorktown, or anybody, when you first came to Yorktown, what do you think of about Yorktown? Yeah, you think about this. Yeah, right here. Think about this. We think about the Revolutionary War, and this has predominated the public memory of Yorktown. I have a friend of mine that's been to a military club in Paris. He's a retired Marine major, combat veteran from Vietnam, and there is actually a Yorktown room in this military club in Paris with all the paintings and everything. And he said it was like being at home, except the food was different. And the wine was a little bit better, but yeah, I could probably learn to rough it a little bit over there. But anyway, so you have John Trumbull's image of the surrender of Lord Cornwallis, and we won't go into the fact that wasn't Lord Cornwallis in the image, but how many of us have never seen this before? Yeah, pretty much everybody in this room would have seen this image, and that's why most people come to Yorktown. But if you live in Tidewater, Virginia, whether you're in the city of Newport News, city of Hampton, Old Princess Anne County, Virginia, which is now the city of Virginia Beach, there's so many layers of history. Matthews County, great place. Gloucester County. So this is one of the layers of Yorktown's history, and I'd argue it's a very important one. And it's one worth sharing with visitors. Yorktown in the Civil War was again part of a pivotal campaign in American history. The British earthworks still marked the landscape of the old colonial tobacco port, and the Civil War soldiers were aware that they were in a cataclysmic battle on an old battlefield. There was a soldier from Alabama that wrote back home and said, "I'm here where Lord Cornwallis surrendered." Some of them may have been a little more apropos, but they were quite well aware of where they were located. And today we'll also talk a little bit more about the Civil War had some cool and groovy items that they did not have in the Revolutionary War, like improvised explosive devices. They had landmines. They had ironclads, and something that I would have never thought we'd talk about in military history very often on CNN and other places and Fox, balloons. Yeah. So who would have ever thought that something the French had go up in 1780 something, and then we had in the Civil War the first operational use of balloons. An American military siege was right here in Yorktown. So we have 21st century now dealing with 18th to 19th century technology. Thought about putting up an image from World War I with a balloon and one of the French or American planes trying to shoot it down, but we'll go with that. Just keep that in your mental image. All right, so, I like this. All right, so can we all see where we are? Yorktown, Gloucester Point. Timberneck's in that direction, right, Tom? Good job. So, Lee Hall, the world's favorite place for Michael, is right there. Enview would be about there. There's Big Bethel, Little Bethel, Newport News, and Fort Monroe. So, the Commonwealth of Virginia seceded from the Federal Union on April 17, 1861. On April 21, 1861, the Virginia militia seized the Gosport Navy Yard in Portsmouth. They may call it the Norfolk Naval Yard, but it's not in Norfolk. It's in Portsmouth. And when they seized it, they were able to capture a lot of heavy ordnance, things such as things that we would never think that's important. Rope. You need rope. Naval works. They had naval works in the Revolutionary War out near Chesterfield County to make rope. So there was a lot of things that they were able to get, and those cannons came from the Gosport Navy Yard, and they went to Yorktown and Gloucester Point, and they were parked all along the edge of the river. Now, Major General Robert E. Lee assumed command of the Virginia Land and Naval Forces on April 23, 1861. And where was the first shot fired in the Civil War in Virginia? Bingo, ding, ding, you win the rubber exploding cigar. Good job. Gloucester Point. Right at Gloucester Point. Across the York River at Gloucester Point, the Richmond Howitzers, who were formed by George Wythe Randolph, who happened to be Thomas Jefferson's grandson. He was a U.S. naval officer. He had been educated at the University of Virginia. Go figure, his granddad was Thomas Jefferson. I don't imagine he had to fill out a lot of paperwork, do you think? Probably not. So, and he commanded the Richmond Howitzers, and they engaged on May 7th, 1861, a U.S. gunboat by the name of the USS Yankee. Isn't that kind of ironic? We have Chinese balloons here in Yorktown, and we have the first ship that they engaged with called the USS Yankee. Now, Yorktown and the Virginia Peninsula were recognized by both sides as a strategic area. Because if you look at the map, you have the Chesapeake Bay, you have Hampton Roads, you have the James River, you have the York River, Washington, D.C.'s up the Chesapeake Bay into the Potomac River. All of this area is very important, and Fort Monroe will go into that in a little bit. So if this is an important area, you're going to send someone down here. And you recognize this individual. That's John Bankhead Magruder. Yeah, John Bankhead, like Magruder Boulevard, Magruder Elementary, all that sort of stuff. How do you think he looks? Most people think he's dashing. He would say debonair. He's a bit of a bon vivant, all those French words. He looks like George Patton and George Custer had a child, or they took him dressing. Because he has shoulder boards, he has Austrian knots which the Southerners call chicken guts. And look at he has on his trousers, he has the gold, stripes. He has a big chapeau that is an ostrich feather. Oh yeah, so he is definitely the cock of the walk there. All sorts of aigulets. That is a gold sword from the Commonwealth of Virginia from his service in the Mexican War. So we'll talk a little bit more about him in a little bit. So he arrived in Yorktown on May 24th, 1861. He was born in Port Royal, Virginia, not Front Royal. Front Royal's out in the mountains. Port Royal is on the Rappahannock River, right where the 301 bridge goes across. Yeah, right above where Lowry's used to be. Bingo. So, Colonel Magruder, before he was Colonel Magruder, went to the University of Virginia. Then he was an 1830 graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point. He was a Mexican War veteran. He went out a captain, came in a brevet lieutenant colonel, which brevet means temporary. But he was the Macaulay Culkin of the old army. He was the party animal. He never reached the permanent rank because they say he knew his windages as well as his vintages. He was an artillery officer. And Stonewall Jackson, before he was Stonewall Jackson, Thomas Jonathan Jackson said that he was the finest artillerist he ever had the privilege of serving under. And so this is the man they sent here. And there's a lot more we could talk about him. But let's just say he was an interesting person, and when they say that history's dull, they never met John Bankhead Magruder. He was a very interesting man. He never thought that warfare should get in between he and having a good time. And he lived that to the motto. Now, his first headquarters here in town was the Customs House. Any DAR ladies here? Okay, well, that would be probably not a place you'd want to be in having your meeting while he was there. Bit of a wild boy. That became his headquarters, but also he's a smart guy, even though he liked to party. One of the things that the military talk about is indigenous personnel. Locals. Even the armed forces have a fancy word for locals. Indigenous personnel. So you find local guides. He found the sheriff of York County that gave him a tour of the peninsula, and then he went to Lee Hall Mansion to see Richard Decatur Lee, where I work, and he gave him a tour of the area because there's nothing like going to actually see people and get out and ride around to kind of figure out what you're going to do. So Confederate volunteers poured into Yorktown from all over the South. You have people from what's now the city of Hampton. You had the Wythe Rifles. You had the 1st North Carolina Regiment. Colonel Daniel Harvey Hill commanded them, Stonewall Jackson's former brother-in-law. And you had the Louisiana Zouaves. Now, anybody done a little bit of research? Anybody from Louisiana? Nice folks from Louisiana. Been there many times. We can say the Louisiana Zouaves were not boring. Yeah, because Colonel Sulikowski commanded people from New Orleans, and they weren't really native Louisianans. They were Hungarians, they were Poles, they were Swiss, they were Irish dock workers, and the only thing that held them together is he was bigger and badder than they were. They were in a Richmond hotel, and they were breaking up everything like it was a Who concert in the 60s, and he went in there and shot somebody right in the mouth and blew his teeth out the back of his head, and then magically everybody stopped drinking, got on the train, and came to this area. Kind of broke the fight up. Somebody went after him with a chair and he just went bang. So, kind of evaporated. Yeah. So, these are the types of people Magruder had for the first real battle of the Civil War, and that's at the Battle of Big Bethel. And if there's Big Bethel, there's Little Bethel. Little Bethel was the African American church. Big Bethel was the white church. Right on the border of York County and now the city of city of Hampton. So it's June 10th, 1861. Now, after he rode around all over these places, Magruder decided that he was going to put up 3 lines of defenses across the Virginia Peninsula. He knew that he did not have enough men to stop the army if they came to Fort Monroe and some other places and moved up in this way toward What would be up the peninsula that he would be interested in trying to protect? Richmond, Virginia, and we'll get into that in a minute. So when they put up the lines of defenses, you can see the first line. How many of you have ever been to Young's Mill before? Right on Route 60 in Newport News. Follow that right through the liquor store and the pet store, Patrick Henry Mall, and somewhere in this direction, you go over to Ship's Point. That's the first line of defense. The second line actually incorporates the old British earthworks and follows the tortuous course of the Warwick River. So the fact that we actually still have 85% of that is due to the fact that Colonial National Historical Monument was created to protect the 1781 battlefield, which ironically was the same place they had the 1862 battlefield. And then the folks in Newport News decided that Collis B. Huntington said, you know, we need a lot of water. So let's create a reservoir or buy up all the watershed. That's why even if you don't live in Newport News, guess who you pay for your water for? Newport News Light and Water Company. That's what he started. So it preserved that. And then the third line of defense is up in Williamsburg in between College and Queens Creek. Now, how were these earthworks constructed? Yeah, a lot of people with shoulders. Soldiers were involved in it. They also had local enslaved persons that dug earthworks across the peninsula. Richard Lee rented some of his slaves to dig earthworks on Mulberry Island, which is now Fort Eustis. I doubt they were seriously thrilled about that. Richard was paid 50 cents a day, but it did mean that their names were put into a journal. So when we tell people when they come to Lee Hall, well, we do know some of the slaves' names, because if you've ever done any research on the enslaved population, you get what? Two things. Get that. But after that, you get age and what? Gender. Age and gender. That's it. There's no names. So that helped kind of take care of that. So as they were digging throughout the year, the Confederates also built winter camps in this area. They skirmished when the Federals down in between Howard's Bridge and down toward where Coliseum Mall is. They fought at Young's Mill. They fought down in Newport News near Cedar Lane and down toward where the shipyard would be today. Now, Christmas time comes in 1861, and who's leading the charge? Magruder. Magruder liked to have a good time. Remember they say when you're at an office party you're not supposed to have a lot to drink? He's in charge. It's not a good thing. There was no adult supervision. He was dancing with Dr. Richardson's wife, and she kind of twirled him around, and he went into the fireplace at the Nelson house. Luckily, he got him out in time before he caught the house on fire, because he did like to enjoy his alcohol. And he was over at Gloucester Point. He was a lot of different places. But he was a very shrewd soldier and made sure that his defenses maximized the amount of people he had. And there were supporting earthworks over at Gloucester Point here. And then over in Isle of Wight County at Fort, it looks like Hugger, but it's actually Uge or Uji, all that fun Huguenot stuff. And then Fort Boykin, which goes all the way back to John Smith's time period. But they just reworked it a tad bit. So he's facing folks that are here. Everybody knows what that is, don't they? Fort Monroe. I think we can even see the old Paradise Ocean Club in the background. Magruder would have loved that place. Yeah, he would have been getting down. But anyway, when Virginia seceded from the Union, Fort Monroe was the only federal installation in the Upper South. On May 19th, 1861, Major General Benjamin Franklin Butler, what a handsome young man, assumed command of the Department of Virginia at Fort Monroe. He was a political general. He was an attorney. He was a state legislature person from Massachusetts. He was an important Democrat, and oddly enough, most people don't understand, who was his best friend in Congress? Yeah, Jefferson Davis. And who told you that? Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Bill. My check is coming to you soon. Bill's only known me since I was 30 years old, so, you know. We've traveled around a lot over the years in the history machine. So, but Butler is a war Democrat, and Lincoln needs their support. Now, that's an odd thing that at that time period, you would have people that have no military training actually leading troops in combat. And they actually elected some of their officers. Anybody an airplane pilot in here? Okay. Let's hope that we elect you to fly the airplane. Not just go, okay, Michael's up here, so we'll let him fly, Yeah, so they had some strange ways of doing things. Now, on May 23rd, 1861, one of the things that he did is there were some enslaved persons from Sewell's Point that were actually from the Hampton, Virginia area, Frank Baker, James Townsend, and Shepard Mallory. They escaped to Fort Monroe. Well, there was no question of them being emancipated at that time period. It's the very beginning of the war. There's the border states. They don't want to get them all freaked out. But also they were being used by the Confederate government to dig earthworks. So Butler, being a lawyer, declared them contraband of war. Very smart move. Very smart legal man. And may not look like much, but he was smart. And he avoided the issue of emancipation and allowed them to seek refuge at Fort Monroe. So thousands of enslaved persons from all over the peninsula went to Fort Monroe. And guess where they later went? Yorktown. Came to Yorktown. Yeah, they came to Yorktown. Actually, there are probably more contrabands here than there were at Fort Monroe, but you hear more about it at Fort Monroe. Now, on May 27th, 1861, Butler sent 3 Union regiments to Newport News Point, down here. And he renamed his earthwork down there Camp Butler. Why not? So they went down there, and imagine what it would be like going down there today. There's the coal piers, there's the shipyard, there's the coastal brewery and other such, things, distillery, ironclad distillery, all that stuff. Didn't look like that back then. No railroad, no shipyard. It was farms. So they came down there, they occupied it, and they created a secured anchorage for the U.S. naval presence down there, the North Atlantic Blockading Squadron. And between Fort Monroe and Camp Butler, they were able to provide force projection platforms for riverine and coastal operations along the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico, which in English means they had a place to hang out. And they could go anywhere they wanted to, and nobody could stop them very easily. But when we speak to military officers and folks, they always like force projection platforms. They like that. Now, Fort Monroe is only 70 miles from Richmond. Why is Richmond important in 61 to 65? It's the Confederate capital. It's the political capital. It's not only Virginia's capital, but it is the Confederate capital. But it has other things. Somebody said railroads. Okay. Well, they have 5 railroads there, so it's a transportation hub. What else is important about Richmond? Yeah, they have the South's largest ironworks. The Tredegar Ironworks there, right near Bell Island and Browns Island, they created an entire, they already had a manufacturing center there that was retooled for the ordnance industry. So that made a big deal. That's why they fought so long. You can always move a political capital, can't you? A little harder to move all the industry, and there's railroads, there's shipyards, so that's why it was important for Magruder to be down here and put up those lines of defenses. And that's why this gentleman, comes to forefront. Now, who is this? McClellan. George Brenton McClellan, Philadelphia native. Great place to be from. And he graduated in the United States Military Academy class of 1846. What was his rank in his class? What did he think he should have been? Number 1. He is the president of his own fan club. He was quite confident of his abilities. He was someone who is also, unfortunately now, the low-hanging fruit for most Civil War roundtables around the globe. Even Australians and Germans talk about him. But he pays the bills in my house, and I like that. So I like McClellan. McClellan, in some ways, I think that you need to look at his career and understand him a little bit. And it doesn't still make him, he has some serious, we'll talk a little bit about some of his problems he had, but he was a very young man. We forget how young he was, and he was kind of like the boy genius. He was very young. He was only 34 when the war started. He's not old. And as a young officer right out of West Point, he was put on General-in-Chief Winfield Scott's staff. How many of you have ever heard of Winfield Scott? He had been a general in the United States Army since 1813, and this is 1861. He's a septuagenarian. There's nothing wrong with being in your 70s, but that's like being in your 90s today and still being in active field command. So, Winfield Scott had been the commanding general of the U.S. Army from 1841 to 1861. So in 1855, McClellan received a captaincy. He had been an officer in the engineers, a first lieutenant and a captain. He was brevetted in the Mexican War. He met Sam Grant. He met Robert E. Lee. He met Joe Johnston. His future adversary was one of his best friends. They all knew each other. Like this would be the entire officer corps of the United States Army, and we split it right down the middle. One side went one way and one went the other. You all knew each other. You went to school together. So, he was a bright young man, and as a captain in the cavalry, he was sent to the Crimea, which until a few years ago, nobody knew where the Crimea was, or the Ukraine. I talked about that. You had to explain to them the Crimean War. So, he went to the Crimean War when the French and the British actually were getting along, and they were attacking the Russians. And while he was there, he saw the destructive firepower of rifled artillery. Things that could fire 2,000 yards accurately. How far could they fire those Revolutionary War cannons that we look at the different museums? About 800 yards for the first parallel. They could fire a little bit farther than that, but accurately about 800 yards. They could nail things at 2,000 yards with rifled artillery in the Civil War. And that made a big difference. He also, if you were in the French Army, we were in the French Army fighting against the British Army, and we had those smooth-bore Charleville muskets. How far do you think we could shoot? Yeah, a football field at best. We'd be really good between 30 and 50. But you could reach out to 100 yards. With a rifled musket in the Civil War, you can tap people at 800 and 900 yards. So you've increased threefold the firepower that is now, and guess what their tactics were still developed for? Marching along in linear warfare and being slaughtered. Which works as long as you can't shoot past a half a football field accurately. But when you're dropping everybody right and left at 200 to 300 yards, that is a game changer. And McClellan, as a young man, saw that. Now, he wasn't going up in the world fast enough, had a hot wife, and she wanted more money. And he decided that his fortune would be made in the railroad. So he resigned his commission in 1857. He was the chief engineer and later the vice president of the Illinois Central Railroad. Guess who the chief legal officer was?
Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, Abraham Lincoln. So they had met before. They knew each other. That had a determining factor on their relationship as well. So from his work with the railroad, you might say that McClellan understood logistics and supply and moving things around. That would be helpful to be a general, wouldn't it?
Yep.
You have to know how to move things. I mean, D-Day in 1944 didn't just happen magically. You had to have people that are able to do that. So at the outbreak of the Civil War, at the age of 34, he was commissioned a major general in the Ohio militia. The governor of Ohio thought enough of him, just magically made him a 2-star general. And he organized folks from Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, and at the age of 34, on May 14th, 1861, this is how much they thought of him. They made him a regular U.S. Army major general. And he outranked everybody except whom? Winfield Scott. People that, imagine you and I had been colonels for like 20-something years, and suddenly you've got a 30-something-year-old that's a 2-star general that outranks you, and you were in the Army before he was in 3-cornered pants. Yeah, might make you a little testy. And did he like being a general? Yeah, he did. Yeah, he did. So, now, after his victories in Western Virginia, he did have many victories over there. He took command of the Army of the Potomac on July 26, 1861, and he immediately met with President Lincoln, who they knew each other, his cabinet, General Scott, and members of Congress. People were waiting. When he came from Western Virginia to D.C., they had people lining the railroad tracks to meet him. He was a popular person. And immediately when he came, because this is after the battle, July 21st, 1861 Battle of Manassas or Bull Run, he immediately whipped the army into shape. He made them start drilling, he had training, he had schools, he instilled discipline in them, and you would think that would make the soldiers do what? Hate his guts. But they didn't, because he had star power. He had an entourage. He would have been in the Grammys. If they had the Grammys back then, he showed up with a posse that included French royalty. Now, you know you're a rap master when you show up as a Civil War general and you have French royalty with you. Even if they're not on the throne at the time, they're still royals. And he had a printing press that went everywhere with him so you could find out what he was doing. So he was a really far-thinking person. Now, the Army of the Potomac grew from 50,000 men in July to 168,000 men by November of 1861. Whipped them into shape, created the largest army in American history up to that time period. They had 228 field guns. And despite his organizational skills, why is he not going to be someone we think of like Grant that won? What was his Achilles heel? Never could, not just that, did he play well with others? No. That is a definite yes on that. He suffered from a lack of diplomacy that I think maybe some age would have helped him and experience. We've all been young. It's fun to be young and smart, but it's also nice to be humble. General-in-Chief Scott was ridiculed by him as old, fat, and feeble. He was old fuss and feathers because he always liked wearing a lot of wild uniforms, and he called him old, fat, and feeble, and a perfect imbecile. And when McClellan replaced him in November of 1861 as General-in-Chief, he looked at him and said, "When you came here, you had my friendship and respect. I leave with you having my respect." Wah, wah. So, Lincoln. How did he think about Abraham Lincoln? The original baboon. A perfect idiot. Now, this is the President of the United States. Never been in the armed forces. Okay? You would think that if the President of the United States and the Secretary of State showed up at your house to call upon you to take you out to Scoot's Barbecue or the pub or something down here to hang out, you would do what? Go out with them. He had been out partying with Mrs. McClellan, came in, and they tell him the President and the Secretary of State are in your drawing room. And you know what he does? Goes to bed. Doesn't even go in to say, "Hi, it's been a long day." Just goes right to bed. So, yay team, So, he's ambitious and young. Lincoln's relationship with McClellan continued on a bad course into the next year as his patience started to run out with the young general. And the Peninsula Campaign was formulated by McClellan as a rapid advance and capture of Richmond to end the Civil War. So let's get right to brass tacks. Okay, here we go. The Battle of Hampton Roads, woohoo, on March 8th, March 9th, 1862. The only thing you need to know out of this for Civil War Yorktown is they had a 2-day battle. There were 5 ships in the North Atlantic blockading squadron, and within about 2 hours of March 8th, there were only 3 left. Yeah, so they lost the USS Congress, USS Cumberland. And the CSS Virginia and the USS Monitor fought to a draw on the 9th. Even though it was a draw, it was a strategic victory because the CSS Virginia blocked the U.S. Navy's access to the James River. And it meant they would have to go into the York River. Why did they not want to go into the York River? Because there's batteries at Yorktown, all on the waterfront, and then over at Gloucester Point. Could they have gotten through here with some ironclads later? Maybe. But they didn't try. At that time period, it's not, I wouldn't say fair, it's not reasonable to think of the military being structured the way it is back then as it is today. Today you have the Department of Defense, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all sorts of other stuff. Back then you had the President, the Secretary of the War, and the Secretary of the Navy. There was no umbrella organization to make everybody get along and play well, was there? No. No unity of command, and sometimes you'd have a unity of effort, and they spent more time fighting each other than who? The enemy. That would seem to be a basic thing you would want to learn. So McClellan, big surprise, didn't get along with the Navy guy, did he? No, he didn't. That's not a big surprise. So he decides that he's just going to go straight up the peninsula. Now, on St. Patrick's Day in 1862, the Union Army of the Potomac embarked, and in 3.5 weeks, in 389 vessels, they moved 121,500 men, people, 44 batteries of field artillery, 101 heavy siege guns, including 100 and 200-pounder Parrott rifles, 8 and 13-inch Seacoast mortars. They brought with them about 15,000 animals, 1,100 wagons, and the other massive equipage for this operation. Largest amphibious operation up until World War II. And he did it like a champ. So the Confederates in Yorktown, what do you think Magruder's doing? No, he's not falling in the fireplace. He's paying attention. It's got his attention because they don't know where it's going. It could go to North Carolina. It could go south side. He's wearing, says beyond balloons, what else do we have today that we can use? This thing. This is a telegraph. You can text people. It's no different than having a telegraph. So he was telegraphing, and it got so bad, General Lee told him to do what? Stop telegraphing. We get it. There's a lot of people down there. There's nobody to send to you. Chill out. That was the short of about 5 sentences. So, the Confederate capital was in imminent danger because how many men did Magruder have? About 13,000. 12, 13,000, depending on who was sick and who wasn't. So, never been in the armed forces, but can you imagine having 121,500 people against how many? 13,000. That's not good. So, on April 4th, 1862, the 3rd Corps of the Army of the Potomac will move from Fort Monroe to where all the antique places are in Phoebus. They will go to Hampton, go to the Coliseum Mall, move to Big Bethel, past Books A Million, and that's where Tab is. And then Howard's Bridge is where Winfrey's gun store is. Cockletown, Joe and Mima's. And then you head up here to Pops. And there's Marlbank. So, does that make sense? Now, if you weren't locals, for people online, they're probably like, what are you talking about? But you all are going, okay, got this. All right, the 4th Corps moves from where Ironclad Distillery, Newport News Shipyard, the coal piers. They cruise past the Virginia War Museum, the Mariners Museum, and come up to Young's Mill. That's on April 4th. It's a great day. No rain, sunny skies. All the diary entries talk about how fun all of this is. Yeah, it's about ready to get real fun. Now, when they move through this area, what type of intel does McClellan have? He has the Pinkerton agents, which are good for guarding the president and keeping people from robbing banks, but they're not military people. Where did their maps come from? Yeah, they have French maps. They're 80 years old. I like Esso maps from the 60s and 50s. Anybody remember Esso? Yeah, Esso's great. Even have an oil can Grandpa Pop Moore gave me that has Esso on it. But would you and I get in a car, even if it was a Nash Rambler, and go out to Arizona using an Esso map? Things may have changed a little bit. So they also don't have the, remember why did he have Richard Decatur Lee take him around? Wanted to show him where the Warwick River was because they had the Warwick River going in the wrong direction. That would be helpful to know that, wouldn't it? Be a little helpful to know that. The lack of local intelligent and accurate maps in his decision-making process made this bad. Colonel Eric Bush and I conducted an intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance Air Force staff ride in March of 2016 for a 2-star general. She and her staff went with us around this area to look at how in the 19th century people gathered intelligence, because warfare went from being 2D to 3D with the advent of balloons. Now, Magruder is going to fall back from the first line of defense and go to the second line of defense, which is right through here. All the way from Yorktown, ding, 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 all through Newport News Park, right over toward Mulberry Island. So, Magruder is going to stop him at the Battle of Lee's Mill, which is actually not here where it says it is. That's actually Lee's Mill is down here. Put that on the National Register. That's actually dam number 1, but who drew that map didn't know that. So they're stopped them there, and also they're stopped in front of Yorktown. And when the two wings of the Union Army come together at the Discovery Center in Newport News Park, they go, oops, there's 12 miles of fortifications. The river was supposed to go parallel to the James, so they were supposed to just keep on cruising. The 4th Corps was supposed to go here, to the halfway house. Why do you think they called it the halfway house? Not real complicated. Halfway between Williamsburg and Yorktown. There's one down here too. And there's one between Richmond and Petersburg. Back then, they're not real complicated about telling things sometimes. So Magruder is faced with a large army coming up together, and he has fortifications, and there's diary entries and other official entries that talk about him moving his troops around, and he supposedly creates double the numbers. But again, what was McClellan's pre-war training? What was the branch of service he was in originally? It's an engineer. And what had he seen in the Crimean War? Siege warfare, but he also saw what happens when you mess with people that have good firearms. And he also, one thing we forget when we talk about McClellan, who are they fighting? Austrians, Russians, Prussians, French? No, they're fighting who? Fellow Americans that one day will have to come back to the fold, and if you kill everybody over the age of 8, that would probably not make them happy campers. So, McClellan believed in a little bit of limited warfare. So, he is going to set up 14 batteries for 101 heavy siege guns. And this is a plan. This is about where we are. It's right where the apartments are. The church is right about here. Here's the bridge, would be coming over here. Here's the toll booth. Came from Gloucester. And out in the woods, out in here, over toward Newport News Park. These are the Confederate defenses through here. And then there's siege lines out here. These are the types of guns he brought with him. Those are big boys. Those are 100, and there's 5 100-pounder Parrott rifles and 2 200-pounder Parrott rifles at battery number 1. And do you know where the Amoco refinery is? That's where it is. They could fire all the way from the Amoco refinery to Gloucester Point. They could have lit the bridge up and down there where the hot dog stand is. They could have fired all the way to where Miss Matthews and Nick had their first seafood business. Right down where the bridge would be, and the the Spectrum. I wasn't allowed to go in there because I was too little, but if some of you that are a little older might remember that. But anyway, they could fire all the way to the Waterman's Museum. That's a long distance. So when they bring the Carnival cruise ship in, or whatever Princess cruise, that thing would be in imminent danger. So they bring these things in. They're able to fire accurately about 2,000 yards, and they did open up on May 1st on some Confederate vessels, and they called the shells flying lamppost. Yikes. That's over where the Coast Guard base is today. That's battery number 4. That also could light up the Yorktown waterfront and could also fire all the way to Gloucester Point. Those are 13-inch Seacoast mortars firing exploding shells and a high arc, so that's kind of scary. Now, one of the things I normally have to explain a little bit more about during the siege is the use of these balloons. In the spring of 1862, the air power on the entire planet Earth was right here in Yorktown and in this area. There were 3 balloons, 1 Confederate, 2 Union. So the entire air power of the entire Earth's armed forces was right here. I know Revolutionary War is cool, but the Civil War has a few things to pull out of its sleeve. So they had observation balloons. What type of training do you think these folks had? Okay, you knew how to operate the balloon. Great, that's helpful. But did you have the ability to look out across the planet Earth and really know what you're looking at? No. There's the curvature of the Earth. You see some things running around. Magruder actually had them dig more Johnny holes to confuse them. They had a scientific thing that there was like 3 people for each latrine pit, so he had to make them build more latrine pits. They really didn't have a way, and that's why the Air Force General, she had her staff here, is that she said, we have to look at intel and be able to make sense of it. They didn't have any training to do that. I mean, they could go up and see stuff, but it wasn't quite the same. Professor Thaddeus Lowe provided General McClellan with information about the Confederate defenses along the War Yorktown line. And he had the hydrogen balloons, Constitution and Intrepid. They were formed by making gas that was pumped into them by taking sulfuric acid and iron filings and mixing them together. Ugh. So that's not going to be real healthy. And in fact, Fitz-John Porter, one of the Union generals, had a free flight accident. They're winching him out, and all that chemical ate through the rope, and it snapped. And he went up in the air. Where you work, you would have seen him. Imagine you're the only person voluntarily in the air on the planet Earth. And you're floating toward people that are very good at shooting at things, even if they're high up in the air. So he's like throwing sandbags right and left off that thing, and he goes way up in the air, and then he goes, oops, I'm heading out toward the Chesapeake Bay. So everybody's looking at him because you all love a train wreck. He goes out on the basket, pulls the gas thing, but it sticks. So it starts to go and he comes back and they're just blasting away at him, and they even fire artillery up at him. And he's going through there, and this is McClellan's best friend. He rides out on his horse, Dan Webster, and as they go by, Fitz-John Porter jumps off and does a Bugs Bunny on a tree. Grabs a hold of it. They come out with a ladder. He climbs down. The Confederates are doing this. They're playing Hail Columbia, all sorts of stuff. Star Spangled Banner. They're all like excited because he even kind of goes like that afterwards, because I would have been freaked out. Now, General Joseph Johnston is a little bit different than Magruder. Wouldn't have been on a lawnmower trying to find a six-pack after he got his car taken from him. So Joe Johnston's a serious military man. You can look at him. Does he look like he's a lot of fun? No. 13th in his class at West Point. He was shot 5 times in the Mexican War, twice during the Battle of Seven Pines. Tough guy. And he arrives at the visitor center, which is not there, but he goes right where the visitor center is. And he looks out across the field, and what does he see? Yeah, he sees these things. And those things. Oops. And he says, this is a contest of artillery which we are not going to win, so we're going to leave. And on the night of May 3rd, 1862, they fire a horrendous bombardment, and they all take off. And he even telegraphed to Robert E. Lee, who he had also been to West Point with, and said, only McClellan would have hesitated to have attacked. And he did not hesitate to leave. So when they come into Yorktown on May 4th, 1862, what do they find? We already have balloons. What is the other technology they have? Yeah, Subterra torpedoes or improvised explosive devices. Brigadier General Gabriel Rains had tried to use them against the Seminole Indians in the 1840s, but they wouldn't sit still. Imagine that. So he planted them in Main Street. So right in front of this place, there would have been landmines. The Victory Monument, which wasn't there, all that sort of stuff. And there were about 36 injured Federals and 1 civilian telegraph operator that was killed. And how did McClellan want them to clear the landmines? With prisoners of war. Confederate prisoners of war. But unfortunately for him, they're the last ones captured, so who are they? The ones that put them in there. So they're kind of doing the barnyard shuffle through the street, so he has to run cows up and down the street and blow up all the mines. So, now, beyond the scary stuff of landmines, they did capture one important prisoner. Secesh, the horse. That was a Confederate officer's horse. And then he looked like Mr. Ed, like Wilbur, when captured. Anybody ever have children or grandchildren and you're trying to take their picture? Do they wiggle and squirm? No, kids sit still. Nothing wrong with kids, don't get me wrong. But you got like 5 minutes to take your picture. And a horse, that's why the dude's over here doing like this with the hat. And the horse is going like, I just think that, and that's right at Cornwallis's Cave. So the next time you're at Cornwallis Cave, think of Secesh. Also, if you're at the Yorktown pub, which is right here, this is the parking lot, right in here. And the Archer Cottage is where this picture was taken from, and back that way is the Cornwallis Cave. Now, the town was cleaned up, or let me get it this way, in July of 1863. Brigadier General Isaac Wister took command of Fort Yorktown, and he made some immediate changes. When Fort Yorktown was taken over, it became a supply depot for the Union Army. So all of that stuff that you see here, where is that going? All these cannons. Going toward Richmond. After that's no longer working, they still have supplies here, and it's going to go into other campaigns. There's also 12,000 contrabands, former enslaved persons that parked themselves in Yorktown. Smart move. Yorktown is a lot closer than going to Fort Monroe, and they're all where? Right in here. So it creates a little bit of an issue. This guy shows up, Isaac Wister. He's a Philadelphia native. He's an attorney, gold miner, soldier. And he comes in and he says this is the most disgusting place he had ever seen as a military post. He cleans it up, makes sure there's guard duty. Imagine being in the military and you and I showing up and there's no guard. That would be important, wouldn't you think? Have a guard somewhere. Somebody to salute you to make, that'd be helpful. So he also realizes that they need to take better care of the non-essential military persons. So they move the former enslaved persons about a mile outside of the fort near what's the French Grand Battery at Slabtown. They create Slabtown. At first there were 400 to 500 cabins. There was space for gardening, raising farm animals. Slabtown was a clean, orderly, and eventually self-sufficient community. General Wister also requested 30 Quaker teachers from up north. He had been a Quaker. It's kind of hard to be in the Army and be a Quaker because they're what? Pacifist. Yeah. And some of the original abolitionists. So the Quaker teachers taught their African American students reading and life skills to children and adults, and their mission was to make them unfit for slavery. That was what the quote was for. Now, beyond this, you also have Shiloh Baptist Church. So here is the National Cemetery. There's Goosley Road. And this is Slabtown. Right out in here. And we're over in this direction. So, the Reverend Jeremiah Asher of Philadelphia and the Reverend John Carey started Shiloh Baptist Church in the fall of 1863. The church has moved 3 times and continues to serve the community 160-something years later. By October of 1863, Fort Yorktown is also the point of destination for United States color troops. The 4th and 6th United States colored troops encamped on the battlefield near Slabtown. The residents were thrilled to see African American men serving in uniforms and in combat roles. Later, this gentleman, Sergeant Major Christian Fleetwood of the 4th United States Colored Troops, attended Shiloh Baptist Church. He actually helped teach some folks to read, and as a soldier in the 4th United States Colored Troops, he was awarded the Medal of Honor for the Battle of Chaffin's Bluff on September 29th, 30th, 1864. This is a picture of him from the 1880s when he was a major in the Washington, D.C. National Guard. So you can see his Medal of Honor and other things that he has on him. Now, one of the other changes to the Yorktown's landscape is there was a little bit of urban renewal. This is the courthouse. Why is this courthouse not the one we're in right now? Yeah. What's that? Gunpowder. Oops. So, there was an accidental fire. I don't know if somebody was smoking a cigar or having a pipe or something, and all of a sudden there was a big boom and we needed a 4th courthouse. This is the 5th on this site. When was the first? 1697. So, they've had a little bit of issues here. So it also blew up the Swan Tavern, turned it into smithereens. So if you go into the basement, it blew the footings inside. So in several and so you can tell they had a little bit of issue. Now, the Civil War and its conclusions had big changes for not only Yorktown, but the entire United States. One of the constant reminders of the Civil War right where you work is because people are like, why is there a cemetery right on top of a Revolutionary War battlefield? Well, it's because there was a Civil War battle right on top of it. Now, in 1866, Colonel James Moore, no relation, selected this location for a national cemetery as the final resting place for some Civil War soldiers. The Yorktown National Cemetery contains 2,204 burials, 747 are known, 1,436 are unknown. Most of them are Union soldiers, but there are 10 Confederate soldiers and their 3 wives. Slabtown became known as Uniontown. There's one of the signs out that talks about it near the cemetery. In the 1870s, and for the next 100 years, it remained a thriving, close-knit African-American community. By the 1950s and 60s, the federal government began to make moves to reclaim the property and the surrounding to make it ready for the bicentennial and of the Revolutionary War. And the community was unfortunately relocated. And there's very strong ties to that area, and Maureen and I have met some of the folks that have lived out there. And Shiloh Baptist Church moved not once, twice, but 3 times. And its current location is 1974. 1974 they went over right where Route 17 and Gooseley Road. The first one was over on the battlefield where it says original location. Then they moved it to the second location. That one burned down, and then Daniel Norton paid to have the church rebuilt. They still have his stained glass window in the church from 1974. Now, when you talk about Yorktown in the Civil War, do they look happy? No. Back in the day, they say that they didn't smile because they had bad teeth. Those two were not happy with each other. That's right after the Battle of Antietam. It's in November of 1862. A lot of the things that happened at Yorktown impacted that relationship because Civil War Yorktown is not a mere footnote in history. The siege of the Yorktown line fatally delayed McClellan's Peninsula Campaign, which saved Richmond from capture until April 3rd, 1865. Yorktown would continue to provide logistical supply for the Union Army and the U.S. Navy, as well as shelter and education for former enslaved persons. And it was the first real modern deployment of such technologies as ironclads, IEDs, aerial observations. Like I said, who would have ever thought we'd be talking about military balloons? But that was something that came out of this. And when you think of Yorktown, There's so many layers of history. You can talk about the Matthews family, you can talk about the 20th century, you can talk about Slabtown or Uniontown or Shiloh Baptist Church, but the Civil War is not just a mere footnote. And even though the Revolutionary War is going to be very big because of Virginia 250 and U.S. 250 coming up between 2026 and 2031, this is still a very important part of our history, and I really appreciate you taking a Sunday afternoon to come here and see me today. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Michael for a very interesting and informative presentation. We do have time for just a few questions. If you have a question, I'd ask that you please raise your hand, and I'll bring the mic to you. We need to use the mic so that it can be recorded on our video. So I'll throw it open for questions. Anybody got any questions? Questions? Yes, sir.
Hold on.
So I believe I read somewhere or something that along the line that goes from Yorktown to Newport News, that during the flyover of the balloon, Magruder would make, like you said, dummy latrine holes, but maybe was there other things he did to make it seem like there were more men manning those armaments than actually
He
were?
would move his men around in circles many times, and that was for people on the land. But being able, if you and I went up in a balloon, it'd be like you and I being in the space shuttle. You better hope somebody knows how to fly it better than me. And I mean, they really didn't have the ability to digest what they were looking at. Magruder did fire at them. They were able to roll some of the cannons up near the visitor center up and start firing them, but they didn't have accurate anti-aircraft fire, but it still scared the bejeevers out of the Union and Confederate operators in the balloon, because you're a sitting duck in that thing.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
It's like being on the Phil Donahue show.
Are you familiar with that Bruce Catton? The Bruce Catton's last book was based on a diary of a private in the engineers who talked about, one of the things he talked about, dragging all of these mortars and heavy artillery and up there, basically up through what's now the historical tour, where they had to come up Wormley Creek and getting all that stuff off and dragging them all up there, and then when we abandoned Yorktown, dragging them all back down again.
Yeah, the Chismans Creek, also at Ships Point, where the Smith Marine Railway and all that sort of stuff is, they had some of the heavy guns come in there. Some of them came into not far from where Wormley Creek is, but to move all of that ordnance was a Herculean effort, and what really that they had is they were made good pictures.
Okay.
That was about what they were good for. They made good pictures because the Confederates left before they opened fire. You had a question, sir?
Across the road from the National Cemetery is another smaller cemetery. Could you tell us what
That's from
that-
Shiloh Baptist Church. That's where that church used to be.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's for Shiloh Baptist Church. If you're coming from Yorktown and you get past Confusion Corner and you turn right on Yorktown Road, or excuse me, right on Cook Road, and the cemetery's off on your left, the church would have been right on your right where Goosley Road and Cook Road comes together. Vady Hobson's store was on the other side, but that cemetery, that's graves, those were African-American graves from that church. Yes, sir.
When they dismantled Slabtown and moved the people out, did they give them any kind of help to move, relocation?
You'd have to ask Sherman Hill a little bit more about that. They did. The federal government gave them money. Obviously, they would not be thrilled about it. I wouldn't want to have to leave somewhere that my grandparents and great-grandparents had lived. I mean, there was very tight-knit community. I mean, they were paid for their land, but it's still a controversial thing. I mean, it's part of the legacy of the Civil War, and I bring it up, but there's people that are probably better qualified to talk on it on a little more of a personal basis, but I know the historical part to it. Yeah, the roads are still there. You can stand there and you can look at pictures, and German Hill and other people, talk to people about that. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up now. And the questions, if you have any more to talk about, Michael will be available to continue on with you downstairs while he's doing the book signing. So this concludes our program. Before we leave, I would like to make two very quick announcements. We'd like to invite you to visit the York County Historical Museum, which is located downstairs in this building. Unfortunately, it's not open today, but it is a kind of a hidden gem of Yorktown, York County. So if you get an opportunity, I'd encourage you to visit it. Our next lecture is scheduled for March the 19th. There is a flyer on the table outside advertising that, and we'll be circulating those very soon. If you are not already on our mailing list for information and announcements on the upcoming presentations, if you would fill out your email on a slip of paper that's out there and put it in the box, then we'll make sure you include you in any future programs. But I'd like to thank you very much for coming out this afternoon, and I hope you've enjoyed it.